can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr Adam Nichol. Adam is an assistant professor in the Sociology of Sport, coming out of Northumbria University, which I'm delighted to hear. It's a really great place with great people. So, Adam, how are you? It's brilliant to have you on.
I'm good, thanks, Mark, and thanks again for the invite. Really looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, and we were just chatting a little bit before we came on there about just I'm excited because we're talking about sociology, and it's not often a topic actually that we hear probably enough about in coaching quarters, particularly I suppose to really bring it to life for coaches so that they're thinking about this and thinking about sociology in a way that's active and conscious, because I think we simulate a lot from a lot of other domains like psychology or sports science, but we too often forget about coaching's a relational act, it's a social act, and the sociology is so keen. So I'm really looking forward to it. So there's tons of things that we can chat about related to your research, but I think as a starting point it'd be cool to know a little bit what brought you to the topic of influences. So why do you care about influences in the context of coaching?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I suppose for me, it was sitting at the nexus between research and practice as a coach educator, and ultimately wanting to know more about this notion of influence that, coaches play a crucial role for me in shaping the thoughts, feelings and actions or interactions of other people. So it was really understanding more about that. And some of the findings, I suppose, from my PhD had really challenged what I understood influence to be, and various forms of influence, things which I really wasn't anticipating, that then shaped my own coaching practice, but also shaped the way in which I did research and looked at that. So I suppose that was what stemmed the initial interest, was just having this real need or want to know more about how, when we use practices or use behaviours as coaches, if an athlete does something and we praise them, we use silence, we use a question, what is the impact of that practice, of that behaviour, and importantly, how do we know that is the case? So I think, it was stemmed from academic interest, but also from practice-led insights as well, and a fusion of those really that stemmed why I wanted to know more about influence in coaching.
Yeah, it's always the best kind. If it stems from practice, I've always got a bias for that. You need to have that professional knowledge. Now, I must say, it resonates with me in my own works around influences of coach behaviour, but it's that word in itself. And one of the things straight away that I took from your writing and some of the writing that inspired your work, particularly around terms like coaching as orchestration, there was almost like a starting point acceptance that coaches can't control everything. They can only sort of influence, and they can only sort of nudge towards things. And I just wonder if there's something you can speak to about that, because that's, I suppose, the crux of everything, is that we are orchestrating. And for those that maybe who are listening but perhaps haven't had as much of a awareness of that term orchestration, is that maybe a good place to start in this conversation? And again, you tell me, because you've got this. Me as someone who's just been reading this work recently, you'll know the best way better than me. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I really like the concept of orchestration, and I think stemming from Jones and Wallace, Robin Jones and colleagues' work, it really helps for me to frame what coaching is, what it's about. And the reason I like it is because it moves away from this view of coaching as being a linear, simplistic, or rational activity towards one where we are constantly wrestling with issues, we are navigating, and I like the language that is used around navigating issues rather than always resolving or having distinct solutions to issues which we might face. There are certain things that we are always navigating with, and it might not be possible to please all stakeholders that we are working with. So I think the notion that there is a pathos, which is one of the other terms within orchestration, which is almost a gap that exists between the goals that we have as coaches and the actual achievement of those goals on the ground. And there are, of course, many reasons as coaches why we aren't able to achieve unproblematically all of the goals that we have sought to achieve. One simple example of that is if we're working with a team of players and we recognize that they have different needs, they have different wants, and we may have different goals for those different players. At times, we may need to prioritize particular goals over others. So again, another concept within the notion of orchestration really is this idea, and it also links to Hartley's work on political astuteness, which is around rather than trying to achieve what Hartley would call complete consensus, where we have everybody's goals being met and we are able to meet all of our objectives as coaches. It's recognizing that that's not always possible. Instead, should we aim for sufficient alignment, which is where we meet enough of those goals to work towards our own agenda, and recognizing that at times we might have to downplay certain goals and prioritize other areas or needs or wants indeed. So I think for me, that's a really nice point and links with the work on influence, because it, rather than taking this view of coach behavior as being a causal, if you like, a straightforward causal phenomena where we deliver a behavior, behavior A, and it has X impact on outcome B. Whereas for me, I think coaching is much more complex and it's much more multifaceted than that. Often that same behavior of a coach can bring about a very different influence for the same player on a different day, under a different set of circumstances, or indeed for different players. You know, different players might hear the same behavior and respond to that very differently, or the same coach in practice. So I think that for me, the orchestration and ambiguity fits specifically within that notion of influence, because ultimately as coaches we don't know sometimes what influence. We can't get inside the minds of other people, athletes, assistant coaches, medics, doctors, you know, the wide relational network that we are part of as a coach. We can never get inside the mind of somebody else. Yes, we can make some fair assumptions about how somebody has responded, their emotional responses, their verbal responses, perhaps their body language. So we can make some of those assumptions about how our behavior or practice has brought about influence. But without really asking that person, I suppose we sometimes don't know the truth. And even when we do ask them, they could be putting on a front or you know, surface acting themselves. So we never really truly know, I suppose, the influence that we bring about as coaches. But what we do is we work within that uncertainty to make these assumptions and therefore draw upon, well, what should our next course of action be as a coach? What should we do in terms of our practice, our behaviours that we do use? So for me, we're always navigating that space of ambiguity or uncertainty as a coach, which fits really well with the notion of orchestration. Yeah.
No, totally. I mean, I kind of see that from two sides of the coin. I think, and it's interesting that you mentioned that around, you know, about the sort of the expectation that do A and do B in order to achieve C, and we kind of expect that provided we do what's it says on the tin, that we're going to get, you know, the outcome. And I suppose a lot of coach research, whether it's intentional or not, does try to reduce not if not trying to reduce the complexity, it perhaps reduces the visibility, perhaps, in terms of within that process, you know, of what is actually between point A, point B, point C, because that's the underlying mechanisms. And I suppose even even with the coaches I used to speak to, and you're trying to understand the behaviours, you're so correct. It's like you can't fully know why someone's doing something until you ask them, and even then you don't know if the reason why they're saying A and this happens is because of so many other reasons. Could we perhaps maybe delve into that a little bit more, because you conducted a systematic review on the relationship between coach behaviours and athlete outcomes. This was back in 2019, and I suppose one of the things that you found when I was reading this was that maybe largely in part to the sort of dominance of sort of positivistic, questionnaire based, or sort of research that is about finding trends and suggesting there's a certain predictability to things. That coupled with the fact that a lot of psychology-based research is often, inside that space on how coaches can achieve outcomes with athletes, or indeed maybe perhaps why they don't achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. Is there frailties to that work, while still appreciating that, and respecting the great importance that it brings? There's a reason why we have models of the coaching process. There are certain core, components to why coaches do things, or perhaps what they should pay attention to, that in some ways can help not just like the more novice coach, but even the more experienced coach be able to think through things and to, touch back on things to make sure they've not missed anything. Into psychology as well as an extremely well validated and you got a strong evidence base on it. But even going back to the systematic review, one of the other findings you found, and that again we can speak to, is we're still in it's still in such infancy, isn't it? The actual conversation of outcomes, athlete outcomes, and where they come from compared to other fields, where there's thousands and upon thousands of work. I think did your review not? It was only like 200 or 300 odd studies. So maybe we can chat a little bit about that as a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you raised some really interesting points there, and I think
your points. That's why they're interesting.
I think, for me, the literature has come a long way, and we need to recognise and celebrate the fact that we do know now a lot more about coaching. We do know, for me, a lot about the what. So that early, largely psychological work, which was cross-sectional, correlational predominantly, helps us to understand the what in terms of which behaviours or what behaviours do coaches use, and perhaps what are the links to certain outcomes that may be brought about, and whether that's from a psychological point of view, whether it helps to develop player autonomy, for example, motivation, confidence. We know, some of those behaviours that have been linked to some of those things. For me, I think what I was trying to propose with the review is to take a critical lens on that and say, well, as well as understanding those links and the what, can we also then extend that to understand the when, why, for whom, under which circumstances? So really having a contextual understanding of when are those behaviours delivered, and in which circumstances do they develop motivation, or do they develop autonomous approaches to learning? Are there times where that might backfire and have unintended consequences for different people? So really it was, I suppose, to extend the good work which has been done and build upon that good work to say, well, how can we critically understand these forms of influence in different ways? So growing upon the larger cross-sectional correlational work, can we conduct more longitudinal studies? And we are starting to see, and the review did also highlight some good work which has started to look at things in more longitudinal, more complex, and in some cases causal explanations of coaching and the influence that coaching behavior or practice has. So I suppose it was to propose ways forward for us to understand the different ripples, if you like. I quite like the analogy of ripples from, one coaching behavior or one element of practice is delivered, and that might bring about different ripples as if you drop a pebble in a pond, and that will hit different athletes, that just as the ripples would hit at a certain kind of rate, they would go out. And I'm almost contradicting myself a little bit here, because then I think, well, ripples even are quite uniform, in the way in which, so that maybe isn't the best metaphor, but I do like the notion that it will perhaps hit different people at different stages, and have a different influence for them. For some people, they might not engage with or notice that practice at all. So I think that was really where the review had come from. And as you say, we sifted through, I think it was 7,000 papers roughly, and which the inclusion criteria was largely around is coaching behaviour in the study, or coaching practice, and some form of athlete outcomes, are the connections between those two. And as you say, we came to around just over 200 studies which were finally included within that. And then provided almost a map and review, if you like, or a scope and review of what were the large methodologies, who was consulted, and what were the key findings. And largely it was, as I said, kind of cross-sectional correlational studies that used typically one method. Single method approaches were predominant, be that questionnaires, be it interviews, and largely engaged with the athlete's perspective. So again, we were proposing that can we use more methodologies, and perhaps within those longitudinal studies, a complex bricolage of methods together that can help us to really get to the roots, or get to the more complex understandings of coaching and the influence that coaching brings about. And to your second point on the kind of stage at which coaching literature is at, I would agree. I think it's still, compared to other disciplines and fields, very embryonic. We have come a long way, but if you look at the discourse and debates around professionalization, for example, we are still very early in comparison to a lot of fields. So we're still understanding lots about the notion of coaching. We're still understanding where is this going, and how can we understand coaching in more critical ways that will inform policy and practice, and indeed the education of coaches.
So see on that then, Adam, where if I'm the coach who may be listening to this, and the coaches who have got a grown interest in the science of coaching, and I'm always quite stubborn about ensuring that coaching is given the respect it deserves, as it is its own science. But do we have to then be quite honest with coaches and understanding that we don't know enough about causation? Can we actually even know about causation? Because this might be something we can talk about, is that if we understand that there are many correlations and there's relationships between what a coach does in their behaviour and perhaps what an athlete then gets out of that experience. But if we know that, again, these underlying mechanisms and the contextuality of that and the individuality of that depending on who it's with, when you do it, the way in which you do it, what you do, how that compares to previous ways, can we even get to causation? That's a question I wonder. And if that is indeed, if there's even some haziness to that answer, and I know it's a tough, it's a tough question to ask, but if there's some haziness to that, how do coaches use evidence on coaching? And again, is that maybe talking to what you were speaking about previously about orchestration and maybe the comfortability that we need to have with not knowing everything? But that's that tension. It's uncomfortable. That's
definitely. I think again, it certainly links back to orchestration and ambiguity for me. In the not only what we do as coaches always has ambiguity, but also in terms of research, we can never claim to 100% have known something that is fully the truth. We're working towards better complex causal explanations of, in this case, influence, or whatever the topic or the line of inquiry is that we're interested in with research. So I think it almost requires absolutely honesty, that you asked about. Do we need to be honest? I think we do, but it also that honesty needs for me to include a shift in kind of the way in which we use research, or the way in which that is used to support practice and is perhaps used to inform policy and practice. So rather than that golden bullet approach, or that very linear, simplistic model of these findings apply to all contexts, which very few people, I think, would advocate, instead is, well, how might you be able to use this research, this evidence, as a tool to think with and reflect upon, perhaps needing some adaptation to your context? Yes, these findings might support you with it. The theory might support you in developing, refining your practice, or specific evidence might help you. But we will never, in my opinion, be able to get to a point where we can say definitively, here is a list of predefined ingredients or criteria that you must follow to be successful or to be effective as a coach, because that would undermine the points that we just made earlier in terms of orchestration, ambiguity. We're constantly wrestling with those. So I think this shift towards understanding research and deploying research critically, I always encourage students or coaches who I'm working with to try and think in those ways, and to use research to draw upon theory and principles, recognizing that it's never a perfect map onto practice. Instead, it's a tool to think with and reflect upon, to inform what we do in our practice. And again, sometimes what we're doing is, with that research, trying to understand more about what is happening in practice. So practice is sometimes ahead, if you like. We're trying to understand, well, what is going on here, and what helps us to explain what we are seeing, the phenomena that we are interested in investigating. And again, that's very complex, I think, rather than viewing it as a simplistic A to B. It's a much more multiply determined mechanism, if you like, that sits behind that coaching practice, and indeed the impact it has on multiple individuals.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose we're constantly going to be kind of towing the line here between, don't believe in models of coaching, but actually indeed do believe in them, because it's like you said, it's that sort of tension. I mean, it goes back to the need that there is such a thing as, control chaos, that, we know that it very rarely, if ever, in fact, can any sort of cookie cutter kind of approach or recipe to coaching really survive contact with the realities of everyday coaching practice. But there are indeed certain recorded mechanisms, perhaps, or principles or steps. It really does depend on the exact model that you see. But I mean, I'm thinking now for like coach developers, and indeed coaches themselves who are just trying to develop within their own practice, and kind of mentoring themselves in that way. When they, wherever they can do, it's still useful to look for, approaches that are trying to sort of confer a kind of linearity, or at least an appreciation of steps that, even if they are seen as sort of iterative, meaning that you would go back and forth between them, that indeed they can be there, and it gives a starting point. Because I think all the time for like beginner coaches who more often than not just rely on sort of heuristics, it's very much they just trying to cope and get sessions going. And then there's the more expert coach who is thinking far more carefully about what they're doing, and models do offer a touch point on that. But then, like you've suggested, there's so much more to that. And even if you look at the way that coaching models are devised, there's models for coaching, models where we have lifted findings and in a sort of abstract way brought them together, and then we're suggesting this might be useful. But then there's models of coaching, and that's now starting to speak to work that is actually been quite inductive and based within coaching environments, and we're finding out the models of the practitioners and using their professional knowledge and their understanding of where they're at, who they work with, and those sorts of things. And maybe that's the sort of the middle point that we can work towards, is that, trust the model, don't take it as gospel, but be aware of what it can give you, and also maybe have an appreciation for models that have been developed within practice, because maybe they're a wee bit closer to that reality. You mentioned about just not ever really fully knowing, and I'm wondering if that's maybe a nice sort of transfer into what I was wanting to speak to you around, your sort of overarching sort of philosophy around this idea of what we call critical realism. Because from my kind of understanding of critical realism, and it might not be a word that many coaches, or indeed even like student coaches, are often familiar with, that part of what that believes is that phenomena can occur outside of our ability to measure it. Is that correct? Because we can have, in terms of the sort of epistemology, that we can have positivistic or objective approaches to measuring things, or subjective approaches. And again, you may find that this is a correlate, or you may find that this influences that. But again, you can never fully know the stuff in between and the stuff around the edges. And that's, I'm wondering if we maybe can turn our attention towards that now, because that perhaps is a great framework to really understand this ambiguity that's just going to always be there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to come back to your previous point briefly on
Yeah.
I would agree that we need a balance of almost that structure or that scaffold to support us as coaches, and then the movability or the flexibility around that. I think going back and forth between, if it's using models, theories, evidence, and practice, and the iteration of that is crucial, just as we would in research with analysing data, for example. If we're using a theoretical framework to make sense of or explain data, from my point of view, rather than using that as a shoehorn or a hammer to put our data into, it's important to let the data challenge, refine, and potentially confirm or falsify that theory that we are using. So it's constant and an iterative process, just as using models, perspectives as a coach would be. It's coming back and forwards with how does this meet the realities of practice, and how can we use that to reflect back upon what is happening here. So I would agree on that point. In terms of critical realism, for me, critical realism is a broad set of philosophical principles which can underpin what we do in research and perhaps practice. And for me, any research project will inevitably be informed, whether implicitly or explicitly, by these principles that guide us, the decisions that we make, the ways in which we make sense of data, the reasons behind how we choose particular methods, and making sense of what we are looking at. Just as, I suppose, for a coach, implicitly or explicitly, we'll be guided by certain values, beliefs, or assumptions that underpin our practice and what we do, whether we know about that or not. So for me, the nice aspect of critical realism is that it helps us to understand these things in more complex and causal ways. Now, I'm very much of the opinion personally that realism has close ties to and can be compatible with things like moderate social constructionism. So often we view these paradigms or philosophical principles as being very distinct. They're often presented in textbooks as, within a table. They fit nicely and crisply within one aspect, one column, if you like, of that specific table. Whereas I see them as perhaps being more fluid than that and able to support one another in some cases. So I
And
think
could
for
you
me, we need
compare
both.
them then, Adam? So just for those that aren't aware again, like constructivism and that, what is that and how does it compare then in terms of the relationships with critical realism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think constructionism for me is about how do we construct and make sense of phenomena, whether that's objects, whether it's particular entities. We will come to construct meaning about things or objects through different communities, whether that's culture, particular objects. So constructionism is almost how do we come to make sense of what are the lived experiences of people, for example, and how do we collectively as a society make sense of things, if you like, or certain groups. Realism perhaps views a realist ontology, would say that there may be things that exist beyond what we make sense of. And again, I think this is an important point to try and clarify and distinguish, because there have been some critiques from both realism of constructionism and vice versa, constructionism critiquing realism, which it would be nice to try and I'm not going to try and claim that I'm completely ironing them out myself in this podcast, but I think just something to think with is that often realism might critique constructionism of saying, well, anything goes, any understanding or anything, any sense that is made of that, anything goes when we're understanding that. And I don't think that's what any constructionist would try and argue for. And equally, constructionism could level of realism that, well, everything must exist independently to us and nothing can be constructed. We can't construct meaning of things because everything just exists in this world independent of our minds. And I think for me, this is why it needs to sit somewhere in the middle, because we need both of those things. Yes, there may be things which we are trying to explain that are outside of our knowing or our being as individuals, things like planetary movement, for example, whether we, or, global warming to some extent. If we think about that or not, these things will perhaps be happening. Similarly, in coaching, there may be things that we miss or we don't see necessarily, that outside of what we are knowing or observing at that level of the empirical, if you like. But importantly, we also need to reflect that the ways in which we make sense of those things also plays a big role in what that reality is. So in some cases, the way in which you construct meaning about things will have cultural significance and will shape the opportunities that people have or perhaps do not have, the experiences that they have as well. So I think for me, that's why we need both realism and constructionism to understand both of those things and the complex relationships that come with those. I've drawn heavily on the work of Dave Aldevas previously, and I really like his distinction that realism is compatible with moderate, what he calls moderate social constructionism. So versus the extreme end of constructionism, which might be, I think it's known as solipsism, where everything just exists in the mind. And there's nothing beyond that, if you like. So that's why I think, he positions it as moderate social constructionism, being compatible with realist principles and these ideas of causal mechanisms. Often this notion of causality is viewed as a straightforward thing. One entity has an impact on another entity, whereas what realism is saying is it's not trying to say that. It's looking more complexly, if you like, at the causal mechanism. So what are the things which feed together, the entities which come together to create an event, to create an outcome, or to create a higher level entity or thing, if you like. And entities are just seen as things in critical realism. So yeah, I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah. So I'm trying to say it back then in my head. So from a coaching perspective, in terms of being between these roots of constructionism and realist thought or realism, sure, whatever way you would put it. So as a coach, I can read around the topic. I can look at evidence that's perhaps abstract from my own environment. I could in some way infer that it's got applicability back into my environment in the same way that I could also rely somewhat, not totally, on feeling perhaps of more bottoms up, came from me, came from the people I'm working with, the outcomes of whatever my behaviours are, that intervention I've tried to take forward. Neither of those things are correct nor wrong, but they all have to be taken together while also recognising there's some edges around it that I won't have access to. And there's just an element of being okay with that. But even as I say that, I have the apprehension of like, oh, right, okay, how does that help structure me, and how does that help facilitate my day-to-day understanding of what to do? Because this is perhaps, and as I think through this, I see the value of why the sociological viewpoint is so needed, because it's not trying to answer questions. It's probably raising more questions, but that's probably okay, because I think, and I know I come from the opposite background where, and I don't, and again, we're not, I know neither of us are suggesting this, but where psychology-based work, or even work to do with pedagogy or whatever, that is trying to further and further, in a lot of ways, give further and further structure and guidance. But the sociological viewpoint is showing where there's limits to that, I suppose. But is that speaking a little bit to that from a coaching standpoint now, in terms of, how we navigate that space a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things for me that comes in the back of what we discussed on critical realism and links to sociology is this notion of structure and agency. And again, the relationships that occur between those. So structure being the groups or perhaps communities that shape and influence our behavior. Often we view the distinction is made kind of between psychology and sociology, that psychology looks more at the individual. It might be to do with motivation, arousal, anxiety, and so on, for example. And sociology looks at communities and how communities, groups, wider social structures or institutions, it may even be organizations, how they shape or influence our behavior and vice versa. So for me, I think, again, it's necessary to explore both and the connections between those. We need to understand more about the individual, but also how the individual is shaped by these wider social structures that are formed. And again, things like those, I mentioned earlier that the link between realism and constructionism, groups or communities will construct certain cultures, for example, certain ways of doing things, certain norms, that might exist. And clearly that will play a role upon influencing the behaviour of individuals, not determining the behaviour of those individuals, but playing a role in shaping why they might do what they do. They're aware that they will face a systematic incentive as being part of a broader community, that they are expected to act in particular ways. Now, if that's within one organisation or if that's in community and society more broadly, we always have that agency to make a decision about our own behaviours and how we want to behave. Sometimes that agency is, we have more agency or we have less agency, depending upon the power dynamics that might exist there. But I think that distinction for me is really important to look at, how are these things constructed over time, these norms, these cultures, but also recognizing with a realist point of view that A, they are complex, but B, they have a causal influence upon our behavior and upon the experiences that people have, the opportunities that people might have or may not have as a result of these cultures.
Can we stick on that point then, because that's making me think back to when I was reading around the concept that I think it was initially academic, might have been if it wasn't Susie Straught, it might have been Mason or someone or another, and they were mentioning the concept of norm circles, and you're making me think about partly that, but also maybe I often think coaching is a bit about manipulation, because we don't often impose direct, you must do this. Sometimes they do, and in which case they just suggested the agency dilutes even further. But where perhaps it's not, choices seen to be given, there is probably a surrounding norm circle, and again, you can correct me as the way I'm talking about this, where there's an expectation in order to fit in that particular social circle, that the person, and perhaps let's put this into more coaching circles, that the athlete in the group is going to be expected to listen, because the coach has created an environment where, without the coach having to say that there's an expectation to listen, that the athlete feels that either through the way other players listen, or indeed even just through the way that the coach listens to them. And I wonder again, is that part of that careful, perhaps we shouldn't say manipulation, but orchestration, or even it's a form of noticing and acting on that. And again, I wonder if we can now speak around that, because, and again, I know I'm asking multiple questions here, but you're also making me think about the fact that you mentioned about psychology is often to do with the individual, and then sociology is helping us understand the larger system that individual sits within. But this is that therefore makes me think, as coaches, do we tell athletes that because of the fact that they're part of a wider social group, that they are expected to conform, or at least we show them that there's a need for them to conform? And I just wonder again where we can go with that, because that's an influence, and that's actually my larger point. There's you speak about in the paper about influences, and there's more than one type of influence, meaning there's more than one actor that's involved in that conversation. So you spoke about the idea of influence, and then there's non-influence, but there's also indirect influence or unintended influence.
Yeah.
So again, can we maybe get into that, because that was quite interesting to me, because I don't think we often think about the unintended influence. I don't think we often think about norms within a group, or at least explicitly how we influence them as coaches, because indeed maybe some of us don't do that enough when we could. So yeah, where can we start on that? What's easiest?
So let's start with the norm circles, I think, which is again from kind of Dave Eldavas's work, who I'd drawn upon and used in the thesis and largely the PhD to understand this notion alongside orchestration and ambiguity and noticing as well. Understand that the influence of practice, it really helped me as a tool, as I mentioned earlier, that vice versa, kind of the iterative nature between data and theory. It was using those theories to understand practice, but then also practice at times challenged and refined understandings and explanations and challenge those theories. So for me, norm circles, I think Dave Eldavas would argue, a norm circle is essentially a group of people who tend to believe that it is right to behave or tend to act, sorry, in a particular manner. Now, an example of that is queuing, for example, at an airport or queuing at the supermarket. You see a queue, and the normal response is often to just join the back of the queue. We don't tend to think lots about that. We just see a queue and we join the back. Of course, if somebody was to jump in the middle of the queue and skip 3 places forward, that's likely to invite a response. And somebody is likely doing that to act on behalf of the norm circle to protect that norm itself, that they realize that somebody has violated the norm, and they want to reinforce that as being a norm. So norm circles, in and through our interactions over time, can shape dispositions or beliefs that exist within us, if you like, within our neural networks, and those largely unconsciously inform our actions. So like I mentioned, we unconsciously join the back of the queue. Or another one is the language the accents we speak within. Right now I'm probably not thinking a lot about the specific accent that I'm using. I'm just talking. But there may be times also where our reflexivity, our conscious thought, shapes alongside that disposition or that structure, that also shapes how we speak or how we make decisions. So for me, it's a constant balance between that structure and agency, the influence of norm circles shaping dispositions or beliefs that unconsciously influence our actions. But at the same time, most, if not all, of our actions are informed by both structure and our conscious thought, that reflexivity and that agency to make decisions. So I might speak, despite being influenced normatively by groups, communities, family, and upbringing, shaping my accent or shaping the way that I speak. I might consciously decide to change that in particular situations, contexts, or with certain individuals. And just as equally in a coaching sense, we might over time, in and through our interactions with communities, with coach education, for example, and what we've received as a player from a coach, we might come to believe that certain ways of practicing are the right thing to do or are normative for that specific context and culture. That's not to say that we have to necessarily morally agree that that is the right thing to do, just that we are normatively, influenced by that broader culture, that we think that we should behave in those ways, or we face a consequence if we decide to act in other ways. So it might be that over time we come to recognize that adopting a certain approach, let's just use game-based approaches. Somebody might say they're predominantly a game-based approach, and that's not to say they would never use more drill-based practices, but that could be normatively influencing their philosophical approach to coaching. There may be times in front of certain audiences where they want to use their reflexivity, and despite that normative influence, they will change, they will adapt or use different practices, more kind of traditional approaches, if you like, within their practice. So I think, for me, that would be the notion of norm circles. And equally, from a coaching point of view, coaches will try and influence athletes often in these normative ways. They might want athletes to listen to the coach, for example. They might want them to adopt a particular strategy that they are advocating within a game or within a training session, recognizing that athletes will always have agency to make their own decisions to lesser or greater extent. So for what was really interesting for me in the PhD study was that sometimes the athletes made very different decisions to what was advocated by the coach, and clearly that highlighted some of these forms of agency. So we could say then that, is it just athlete agency, or is it the fact that actually they've been influenced by these structural conditions, so that there are still, the influence of those norm circles are still acting alongside the athlete's agency?
It's like, does free will actually exist? It is one of those things. It's so deterministic, I suppose. And it's funny, I digress a wee bit from this, but where I can perhaps pull, so that was a conversation that I'd read about, and this was in much broader terms than coaching, but as we all do, we bring everything back to coaching, because in our universe, coaching's at the centre of it. But I suppose I think the answer to that, because it is debated, is whether or not, yes, someone may be influenced technically to do it, and they may decide to do it as much, but because they've been influenced to do it because of so many other underpinning mechanisms, is it truly free will? Is there true agency? Suppose intrinsic motivation offers us an answer to that even if they've been influenced. The actual willingness and willingly stepping forward into a behaviour would then determine there is agency. It's still was there, but it's a funny one. It's interesting. It might be something because I want to cover this a little bit more from both the coach perspective and then the coach influencing athletes, but also how coaches are influenced themselves. Because you gave a really good example there around game-based approaches to coaching, and that's all you ever hear. Game-based, this is what coaches do. This is what the elite coaches do, and therefore we just unconsciously just do it. Or even, and if we ever feel perhaps about doing something different, if we don't hesitate, someone will probably pull you up for it when you then do it. And I always wonder, therefore, where there's a danger with norm circles, particularly around innovation within coaching practice, because I think probably if we consider the sociology of coaching, we're very tribalistic. If we don't want to have something that's similar to maybe our coaching partner, we certainly want to do something that's still seen as acceptable within the wider, not even culture of coaching, but the subculture to our own sport. And it was a previous argument, and I think this had a little bit more to do with power dynamics within coaching. It's like, who's to say that the way that an elite athlete's taught and the athletes that end up on the podium, who's to say that actually the athletes who don't require a different style of coaching? Who's to say that the reason why these athletes are successful isn't because of the coaching style, but because talent found a way and they just managed to do it despite it? And it's like, these are all very legitimate questions that can be asked of the things that we take often as gospel, but we are very cautious about stepping outside of the norm. And sometimes for good reason. There's tried and tested approaches to coaching, and that's fine. But I do often think people need to be braver nowadays to actually do things that are different within their practice, because they're up against, and that's so hard. And I think with sociology and what you're allowing us to understand is that people are policing it, and it's not from the top dog. It's everyone. It's like, it's a very small, I don't know what you call it, but it is. It's some sort of weird self-policing that can occur. So yeah, there's that aspect to it. But then you'd mentioned around how coaches can carry out behaviours that allow the athletes, much like when someone cuts the line and cuts a cue and steps into some part of the line where they should really be at the back. If as coaches we can develop certain norms around our own cultures, and that's a good thing, where we care about not cutting corners, we care about working hard, we care about, and we communicate that to our players. We can, and we do it in such a way that's really forceful and that really shows how passionately we believe about that, and the players start to take that on. We want that in some extent, don't we, coaches? We kind of want norm circles because that's important for our cultures. There's possibly negative sides to that as well. I don't know.
What would you say? 100%. I think it's almost like imagining a society without any norms. It would be very strange to operate in a society where we didn't know what money meant. We didn't know what the monetary value of things was, and we didn't know how to act in certain situations. I think these norms are really useful to help us in many respects. But as you say, they should never or very few circumstances should they master drive everything that we do. There is always that room for innovation. And for me, just like we mentioned, the game-based approaches versus more perhaps drill-based approaches, using instruction, using different forms of behaviours. It's about understanding the context that we are working within, and how are those behaviours necessary for the people we're working with, the spaces, the times, and so on. So it's I think that innovation is always necessary. And some cultures, the norm might be to have that innovation, that they want to foster creativity and foster innovation. But there will always probably be some norms that exist within that context, because if we didn't have any norms, it would just be such a strange space to work within. So I think, it's for me, it's a balance between structure and agency, but also between those norms that exist. And one interesting example I can think back to from the PhD a while back was where one of the athletes had actively challenged, if you like, the norm, I suppose, and gone against what the coach was advocating. So the coach had gone in at a drinks break and asked one of the batters at the time to play more of a defensive, what's known as an anchor role, and the other batter to play more attackingly. So, the other batter his role was to get the player on strike who was going well, not necessarily to play more attackingly. And the first ball after drinks, or a few balls after drinks, the batter hit the ball out the ground, who was supposed to play the anchor role, be more defensive, decided to come down the wicket to a spinner, hit them out the ground for six. So that's clear use of, for me, athlete agency. They've almost gone against what had been advocated at the drinks break in a normative sense by the coach. However, when I asked the coach, what were his perceptions of that, he said, well, I wasn't really too concerned. I'm pleased that the athlete has used agency because it was still ultimately successful for the team. The fact that he was scoring runs and being positive, he's taken that on. However, if the player would have got out, hit the ball straight in the air and been caught by a fielder, the response would have probably been very different. So sometimes this notion of athletes using agency and going, for me, I would still say that they are influenced by the coach, the structural conditions. They're aware of those structural conditions, but they've worked within those, maybe skillfully here, to recognize that they can violate one of these norms but still meet the broader objectives of the team. And this is where I was mentioning earlier, sometimes, rather than having complete consensus, we have certain goals that are met while we realize we're maybe downplaying or ignoring certain other goals in that context. So that would have brought about a very different set of circumstances had the player got out. But ultimately, I think because the coach realised it was still successful for the side at the time, it wasn't challenged. So does that then open up a norm more broadly for players to recognise that they have this creativity and that they have some degree of freedom to play as they want? And this will be, very different in different contexts. Some people might have felt very pressurized to not play an attacking shot in those circumstances. The different players and the power dynamics that might exist might have led to very different circumstances there. But I think that's just one example which captures really the influence of both structure and agency on individuals' behaviours, where a coach has initially noticed something that's happened in the game, gone in and tried to advocate a particular way of playing to reinforce that norm and almost act on behalf of the norm circle. But recognising that the player still has agency to act in a different manner.
And is it perhaps in that scenario, I'm wondering, where the coach has told the athlete that there's a certain expectation about how they should perhaps respond to an event inside a competition, and the athletes responded differently. Now, I wonder, in the same way that the coach is noticing that event, the player can notice that event. And this was something, again, that jumped out in your writing, and it was so just very well put. And again, tell me if this is the correct academic. Is this the idea of noticing? I think that is coming from Mason. Is that the right one? There was a 2002 paper, and I'm wondering then, is that something that coaches should be aware of, that players notice things as well? And if you are, and this maybe might be a bit of a segue into talking a little bit more about intentional and unintentional consequence of coach behaviour, that if perhaps, and even it links back to the culture we're trying to create as coaches in terms of the norm circles we're trying to create, if we aren't very deliberate and very observant and in the way that we put down certain rules or expectations, if we at any point then seem to be backtracking on those rules, if there's not been an initial conversation about where the rules have flexibility, could athletes then begin to notice that, and that in itself becomes a feature of your environment that you perhaps didn't want? And this is just, it makes me think about where coaches can have very black and white rules, but that can be risky, can't it? Because athletes are, I always say this, athletes are very intelligent. People rarely give them enough credit, potentially because they just forget that they're dealing with people, and people learn through watching and observing and noticing. And I always wonder where coaches perhaps put themselves into bad situations where, unless they've given a rule, it seems like that coach that you're referring to did have flexibility within the rule. But it makes me think about the amount of coaches that don't don't convey a rule that's flexible and a rule where there's negotiation or perhaps, if not absolute agency, some sense of agency within it for the athlete to take it and use it in a way that works for them, that they risk the non-influence that they want to have, that they risk not being able to see the influence they want to have coming to fruition because players notice too. I don't know if you can maybe speak a little bit more to that and maybe bring in now this sort of multi-dimensional concept of influence where you speak around the intentional, the non-intentional, and all these sorts of things come together, because it's making me think now around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like the concept of noticing, essentially, what do we pick up from our environments that we're working in, as you say, as a coach or as an athlete. I think Mason refers to different forms of noticing, or different stages, if you like, of what do we initially pick up from our environments through our senses. What do we mark as being important in those? Because we notice lots of things in everyday life. In coaching, as an athlete, we notice lots of things in training sessions, in matches. But what is it that we mark as being important within those contexts? What is it that we then use in our feedback, for example? We've noticed certain things that have occurred within a match or within a game, and we then use that within a debrief or a drinks break. We focus on particular things over other things that we might have decided to pay more attention to or notice. And then the third aspect of noticing is recording, which is sometimes where we might record in a diary, or we record somewhere the noticing and what we have marked as being important. And again, for me, this is a relational thing. I really like the work of Charlie Cosby and colleagues who've done some work on kind of collective noticing and how teams together, teams of coaches, might influence each other to pay more attention to certain things. They will look for, within the norms that exist in that culture or squad, they might look for certain things because they believe that is what coaches should be focusing on.
Well, we just one that I can give you an example that's ringing in my bell, where I've worked in clubs, and clubs have goalposts. They have expectations for athletes in different parts of the game. If it's the technical performance, the tactical, the social performance, or even the psychological, they have criteria that more often than not the wider group will collectively, go back to in order to assess a player. They'll look at this information first. That's perhaps one example that you see quite a lot from practice, don't you?
Yeah,
Sorry,
absolutely.
I'm just
No,
thinking of
that's fine. And I think, again, it comes back to that structural influence. So because these coaches are working within organizations that may have certain expectations, they're working within policy environments or contexts that require them to focus more attention on certain things, because they realize that they are judged upon those. It might be certain metrics that they need to report back on, or it might be linked indeed to their contracts. If they're on a fixed term contract, they recognize that these outcomes or metrics are more important for them to pay attention to and to report to other people, perhaps. So I think, yeah, it's a fascinating idea, this, but particularly the concept that athletes also notice. And there's a small body of work which is starting to pick up on this now. And what I started to hopefully work towards as well in the PhD and publications which have come out of that since, is the idea that athletes themselves use this noticing to appreciate what their next course of action is and what is the normative response here. Are they going to maybe follow the norm? Are they going to violate the norm? And what are the consequences of doing so? But to come back to the point you made in terms of different forms of influence, this was one of the most, I suppose, unexpected bits of the PhD and the ethnography itself, was how athletes often made sense of coaching practice was very different to what the coach had hoped, in that so he would perhaps deliver a particular behavior or a particular form of practice and perceive it to have had a certain influence. There was a rationale behind why that behavior was used, and also rationale behind why that behavior or another behavior wasn't used in that same environment. And then when we asked the players, so in this case we used stimulated recall, which is essentially showing players back and showing coaches, participants back, video footage of particular moments in matches or particular moments in training sessions, for example, and asking them questions about, well, how did you perceive that? What were your thoughts or experiences in the moment? From the coach's point of view, what were you trying to do with that practice? How did you read the influence that was brought about? And sometimes we saw that even for the same behavior delivered by the coach, it would bring about a very different influence for different players. Sometimes it might be an intended influence, what they had hoped, the impact that that behavior or practice would have on others. And sometimes it was unintended, whereby it had a different influence. And there are two strands, if you like, to that unintended influence. One, that it may influence more players than was originally intended. So we might often, as coaches, direct behavior or practice towards one particular player in the hope that it will have an influence on them, but also that behavior intentionally or unintentionally influences more people than just that targeted player. Or the second strand to unintended influence is that for the same targeted player of the behavior, they perceive it in very different ways. So that the example I mentioned earlier, where the athlete has used their agency, they've decided to play in much more an attacking manner, we can argue that perhaps that is unintended influence that's been brought about. Now, again, in the complexities of this, it could also be argued it's intended more broadly for the team, because the player has still successfully scored runs for the side. So it's meeting some objectives while, ignoring the norm that is being put forward by the coach. Another example of kind of unintended influence here was where one of the assistant coaches was walking around the boundary, shouted on to one of the players in the middle, who'd nearly kind of got out, and the opposition had a huge appeal. Umpire decided to give it not out, to which the coaches kind of shouted on, said, "Come on, work hard, work hard. You need to just kind of refocus here." And again, when I asked, just through field notes, really, this was captured, but through conversations in the field, walking around the boundary with the coaches, I said, what was kind of what was your intention behind doing that? And he said, well, it was to, influence the player in the middle, just to say that, we need to be cautious here, reset a little bit, and just consider the way in which the player was playing. And of interest was that not only did it influence that player, so that the coach had only hoped really it was going to influence the player in the middle, it had also influenced two players who were waiting to go into bat next, sitting in the pavilion. And when I interviewed them and showed them the same footage, they kind of said, well, for me, that was telling me what not to do when I went in. So if the coach is having a reaction to that, I was thinking, well, actually, how should I play when I go in? So from the coach's point of view, again, that could be argued to be unintended influence because it's impacted more people than the coach had originally hoped. But is it, again, potentially also intended in the sense that he may, if he was to influence those other players, he would hope that the same message would have come through to them, and that they perhaps need to play cautiously when they come in. And a final strand, just to add a little bit more complexity, is this notion of non-influence, whereby at times players, for whatever reason, might not have heard or not have seen that, come back to that concept of noticing. They might not have noticed practice for whatever reason, despite the coach hoping it had an influence. So one pertinent example here is where the coach in an indoor session had praised the wicketkeeper for doing something really well. They performed exceptionally, taking a one-handed dive and catch and stumped the batter out, which was really desirable performance. And the coaches kind of clapped loudly and praised from the other side of the hall. Yeah, well done, excellent stuff. And again, when I interviewed the coach, it was to say, well, he'd noticed that practice. He'd tried to act on behalf of the norm circle to reinforce that was a positive thing to do for the players, and he wanted that to increase the confidence and motivation of that individual player, because he's heard it, hopefully, and because he recognizes that one of the coaches has picked up on it, and then by extension it might also impact the other wicketkeepers in the squad to recognize, oh well, that's what I should be perhaps aiming for. And in the realities of what happened, again, in a recall interview with the wicketkeeper, showed him back the footage of the session, and before I'd even asked a question, he said, I didn't even hear the coach say that. I was just so caught up in the moment at the time, I suppose, and just reflecting the fact I'd stumped the batter out, done well. And for me, that was a real unexpected finding, and in the sense that it challenged my understandings of influence as a coach as well, and coaching kind of cricket or coaching and officiating. I thought, well, how do I actually know that I've always just assumed if a player smiles or a player's having a positive reaction to something, that maybe that behaviour has had the intended impact. But actually, in this case, the player hadn't even heard it, despite him smiling. So then I thought, well, yeah, what does this mean for various different forms of influence? The fact that we can deliver behaviours as coaches or certain elements of practice that can have these wide ranges of influence on multiple stakeholders at the same time was really kind of fascinating. And hopefully the paper the latter paper, which has been published in PESP within the last couple of years, works towards capturing that. We often tend to focus on, and it makes sense, we focus lots upon intended forms of influence because that's what we're there to do as a coach. We're there to have these positive impacts and to bring about the influence that we want to happen. But actually, for me, it's just as important to pay attention to these other forms of critical influence, the unintended influence, the non-influence that might be brought about in order to foster more ethical and perhaps effective forms of coaching. And if we can be more aware of this before we deliver behaviours, as we're delivering them, but also reflecting back upon that later on, I think it helps to broaden our net of noticing, our net of awareness, if you like, as a coach. And in that specific example with the wicketkeeper, the wicketkeeper said, potentially if the coach had said something at the end of the session as well, as I was walking out, just saying, that was a fantastic catch or a fantastic stumping on a more individual basis, that might help for him to have kind of been impacted in an intended way from that behaviour. Because of course the other option is to ask a player, but that becomes quite inauthentic, doesn't it? In that you say, right, well, I just praised somebody. Oh, did you definitely hear that? What was the impact for you of that? And the player's like, why are you asking me that? Especially if they have heard it. So I think to do that in subtle ways, and again, politically astute ways, maybe he's at the end of the session just checking in, saying, that was fantastic stumping, well done, might also help to make sure that that's had an intended influence. But yeah, just this to broaden this idea of the fact that we deliver behaviours and lots of behaviours, lots of forms of practice at different times is a really kind of key one to help us understand, what are the potential influences that we are bringing about as coaches. It's a fascinating area.
No, it absolutely is. It makes me think about experiences I've either had myself or when I observe coaches, things that I see, and that makes me consider, starting with the point of non-influence. So one example that really comes to mind is we're taught in this, maybe comes back to sort of contemporary sort of influences on coaches and just the way that trends come in and the way that our norms impact us. So the idea of game-based learning, where it's like the game's the teacher. I see a lot of coaches who will put on very good practices that compartmentalise parts of the parent game in a way that absolutely could be very conducive to players making better decisions. However, if we aren't careful and to explicitly at times paint pictures for actually, look, we're doing a drill that isn't just a 3v2 in this alien space and then we're just going to put you onto a park on a Saturday, that this 3v2 is set in this third of the park. It's meant to be if you receive the ball here. If you aren't sometimes painting clear pictures, and that might be verbalizing on top of the drill or the exercise or whatever way you want to call it, again, maybe the players won't notice that part of it, and then all of a sudden there is a non-influence there. Not to suggest they aren't still kind of implicitly assimilating that information, they could be, but in order to optimize your results, if we were paying attention to and recognizing that non-influence occurs, we would probably have been more incentivized to just double check, just tell. Sometimes you need to tell, just so that players are aware of what you're intending. And then I'm thinking about the unintended influence, and you're making me recall some of my own research with coaches where I've asked coaches about how they use praise, for example, either maybe midway through a match or after it, midway through a match versus after a match. And one of the things that I typically was finding was where perhaps, and this is a wee bit more contextualised to community sport and youth sport, admittedly, but it certainly could still be seen and felt maybe just differently in other environments or in senior sport. But where there was a bit of an ability difference across a group, coaches were often intentional in praising what maybe a player who isn't as capable or hasn't got the same ability as the rest of their teammates. They were quite intentional in praising them in the front of the group at half time. And that's with the intention of helping that player's confidence. that there's an unintended consequence to that of the players who haven't been praised, feeling, why is he not mentioning me? The coaches would also then say, but after the game, I would maybe go around the players that do well already and say, well done. And again, there's an intentional part to that, which is great, and they're being reflective on that. But again, the unintended consequence is that player hasn't experienced the being praised in front of a group. And again, it's not trying to make coaching harder than it already is. And I wonder if that's sometimes maybe a lazy response to sociology can be, that it's trying to just constantly throw up problems for us. But it's like you've said, it's about widening the reflection. If we can reflect in more than one way, that it's not just about intention and did it occur, but what you're offering in this idea of intention, the unintended consequence, the non-influence. So sorry, an influence, unintended influence, non-influence, and we also chart that across the targeted person or group and the untargeted person or group. And again, maybe that even extends to outside of the athlete group, because coaches work around other actors. They work around other coaches. They work around parents at the side. Yeah. But this could all be, this is information and this is sense making that you perhaps wouldn't reach if you weren't to, as you've just proposed, Adam, like if you weren't to think about influence in that multi-dimensional way. And I think that's really effective. That's just attaching a language to it, because you'll know yourself, and I think a lot of coaches understand this too, is that there's that sort of tacit knowledge where we feel something, but it's difficult to verbalize, and we actually just need to find more words in order to attach meaning to what we're experiencing and be able to verbalize it and then work through it. And that's another thing that I think your work brings. We're attaching language to experience, and if we have language, we can understand experience more. And this whole idea of influence and the different kinds of influence is again incentivizing people to work at things more and to just be aware. Come back to the idea, but who is this work pitched at? If you were to roll out, and this is more us thinking about who can benefit most, and maybe from a critical realist point of view, at what time and in what way. Not everyone can at the same way, the same time. Is this a conversation perhaps for a more experienced coach than perhaps a more novice one? The reason I'm wondering that is that it's just paralysis by analysis. I'm always so conscious when I give information to coaches who are maybe just starting out to be careful of how much they need to think through things as they just get comfortable and being in that space. But I don't know, maybe I'm jumping to a conclusion that I shouldn't. Is maybe there's space for this to appease all ages and stages of coach? I don't know. What would you say to that?
I think it's a really good question. And for me, it's again striking a balance. It's not, I suppose, shying away from, in those early days, the fact that at times coaching can be difficult. It can be complex to kind of read these things, and it does require some degree of scaffolding to understand and become familiar with the act of coaching itself, and what are the things that we are wrestling and navigating with. But for me, I think that is crucial. Maybe my kind of sociological bias here, but I think it's crucial to understand that from even an early stage as a coach, that how do we wrestle with and navigate some of these issues that do occur, as well as importantly understanding the behaviours that we might draw upon, the practices, and all of those important facets of coaching as well. But I would say this is equally as important, how do we manage relations, how do we manage emotions, how do we manage conflict, and this is again something which has consistently come up in our research that coaches have asked for more of within their education. They're saying that we really want to understand, in some research we've done on community sport coaching, for example, they want to know more about, well, actually, it's a fundamental part of our role to manage relations, to manage emotions, and in some cases manage conflict effectively. So how do we do that? And we want more to understand that within the formal, non-formal mentoring, that the education that we receive as coaches. So I think, yeah, for me, it's a balance. It could be, hopefully used as a tool for others to think with and reflect upon, be it new coaches, be it more experienced coaches, to broaden their awareness and their net. I mean, an example which came to mind as you were speaking there before was chatting to a colleague from a football academy environment where the coach had asked one of the players to do a demonstration. They'd done something really well, and they said, right, well, come on, you can come and do this in front of the whole group. With the intention of, well, actually, it's going to raise the confidence of that player because I've asked them, I've realised they've done something really well. They've come up in front of the group now, and I've asked them to do it in front of everybody. And from the player's point of view, it was the worst thing that they could have done. The coach had just then made them look busy, in inverted commas, or like the teacher's pet in front of all of their mates, and their lunchtime was now going to be horrendous because they'd been labelled, or asked to come and do this demonstration in front of the whole group. So again, that was a really striking example of where the coach had hoped they were going to bring about a certain influence, and it actually had an unintended influence in this case. So I think just to be aware and not to daunt coaches, or not to try and make this more complex than it is. I think it's just being comfortable with and accepting that we are never, like you said earlier, we're never going to be able to control the actions of others, and we're never going to be able to get everything right 100% of the time, because for another athlete, or even for that same athlete on another day, it might have actually been an effective strategy to use for them. So that's why it's a continual process of us coming back to, be it data, theory, evidence, or previous examples of practice, to think, well, actually, what would I do next time around? I'm not sure I would use that same approach. And again, this links to Susie Scott's work, which I really enjoy as well, which looks at, it's called the Sociology of Nothing. And essentially, Susie Scott argues that lots of the time we focus on things rather than nothings, if you like. So a common example here is that people are often asked, as non-drinkers, for example, why do you not drink? Is that ever asked of somebody who does drink? Why do you drink? Often it's not the case. And similarly in coaching, how do we focus upon these nothings as well as the things which might occur? So here it might be, for example, why have we chosen to use a particular behaviour in that, or a particular form of practice? And why have we not chosen to use another behaviour? Because often what we do as coaches in choosing, right, I'm going to praise that player, or I'm going to use silence, I'm not going to say anything. In order to get to that point, we've ruled out, or we've thought about, well, actually, I could intervene here with specific feedback, but I'm not going to do that for these reasons. So for me, looking at the nothings as well as the things is incredibly important as a coach. And that comes down to our behaviours. It might come down to our identity as a coach. How do we want to be seen versus how do we not want to be seen? And just as equally from a player's point of view, what are the examples where there have been unintended influences or no influence, as well as the influence itself. So I think that approach, which Scott's work really nicely captures, is, you're right, and the point you made earlier, sociology does ask critical questions. For me, it's not about trying to make things unnecessarily complex or to pose more. Often it does pose more issues more questions than problems itself. But again, that comes back to that initial orchestration metaphor of, well, there are always going to be ambiguities, uncertainty, and issues. So rather than trying to resolve those, it's actually just being comfortable with, we're working within that space of uncertainty and ambiguity all of the time. We don't know how somebody's going to respond to something all the time. We don't know what impact a practice is going to have, or a behaviour is going to have. So it's just using that really as a tool to hopefully become more comfortable with it, and more able to think critically about that in a deep manner before, during, and after specific events or practices have occurred, perhaps.
Yeah, I've got, there's 3 questions that are coming out of that then, because I'm interested. We'll start. Firstly, I fully agree with the point you make around, it is important to think about why you don't do things, and perhaps don't do an alternative strategy based on just the temporal nature of how that strategy can be felt. So, I mean, from my own area of work, from a motivational perspective, so organismic integration theory would tell us about the way that people internalize motivations, or they may internalize them from more external motivators initially. to then over time they can become more internal and it becomes more internally driven. And you think about perhaps then that kid, in terms of as a coaching example, that kid who, and I experienced this myself when I was younger. I used to work at like football camps, and there would be some children that are there and they'll want to be there, and then there's the ones that are just kicking and screaming, getting flung out of out of their car to come and be part of your coaching session, just because I don't know, the parents felt it was a good idea for them to be there. And you have to have a different approach to motivating that kid, perhaps in the first day, certainly different to the rest of the kids who are more intrinsically motivated and they want to be there because they enjoy the sport, they're there to have fun. So where it might be there's a bit of a bribe happening with that kid that just doesn't want to be there. Look, we'll do some games, or look, you've only got until here, or sometimes it's a bit of a guilt trip, and it just depends on the way coaches do things. What the kid maybe requires there and then at that one time stamp won't necessarily be the same for them maybe across the week with you, because then they start to actually enjoy the experience. They start to build connections with other people, which we know is so important, the social aspect of it. That in turn creates a different motivational orientation towards the activity for that kid. So now all of a sudden they're doing it because they want to be with their friends, and in fact that they start to kick the ball about and they start getting pretty good at it, and all of a sudden they do it because they want to get better. So now you've had to change your approach and how you motivate them because of that. And that's about understanding the person. And it's interesting that you mentioned about intentional actions by the coach that have an unintentional consequence, and it stems from the coach not also appreciating how the athlete wants to be seen. Because you mentioned that idea of the teacher's pet and things like that, and I know that there are certain things that when I'm coaching, and I think other coaches need to be mindful of, is that you're building your own norm circle, but the actors that are involved in that are also part of another wider sort of, maybe if this is more ecological, they're part of they're part of their own norm circle that goes beyond the boundaries of what you can control. Again, we're talking about that. And that's where you have to be mindful, right? And if I'm working with a young player, it's a young boy, perhaps the sort of attitudes people can have towards certain things there, or if it's a young girl, or if it's an older player, again, there's certain things in changing rooms that you will get a response, and it may not be the response you want, not because of what you've necessarily said within your culture that you're trying to head up and influence, but because of the culture that your culture's trying to exist alongside. Is there truth to that? It's making me think that way now. I'm starting to think around these
it's what
different
I think it's
perspectives.
Georg Simmel calls the intersectionality of norms, and again Elder Vass kind of draws upon that concept to say there are multiple norm circles which perhaps overlap at times, and we might be influenced normatively from, as you say, a range of different communities that we are part of. We're never just, or very rarely, are we just part of one culture, community, or group. We have experiences beyond that we bring with us to those contexts. And at times a good example of this is if we are at a football match, for example, and on one side you've got your grandparent, and the other side you've got your very best friend. As a junior, for example, how do you navigate that space in terms of the expectations of those social groups might be very different in how you respond to a goal being scored, for example, or how you respond to a particular situation, so in those cases, that's where we must draw upon agency even more. We're almost forced to draw upon agency or conscious reflexivity to think, right, what is the best course of action here when I'm trying to please these different norms that are clashing with one another? There isn't necessarily a straightforward answer about how I'm expected to behave or act in this situation. So what's the least worst course of action here for me to take? And again, a lot of these issues crop up in coaching and crop up indeed for us as an athlete or any kind of stakeholder who is involved in that relational network within coaching. But we're often forced with these decisions to make about, well, actually, that there isn't necessarily a straightforward answer, or maybe it's a complex situation to navigate for us. It might be an ethical or a professional dilemma that has occurred, which has these clashing norms. So I think that's a really fascinating line of inquiry to understand more about, what are these problems and issues that coaches wrestle with and a variety of stakeholders
Well,
engage with.
I actually see now perhaps we're getting somewhere with understanding who the way that we coach is, who they are in their own space. So like I think about I'm a big advocate of like coaching techniques like gamification, which is where we're essentially embedding like video game design principles within the way that we coach as an incentive for young kids to engage with it. Now that's understanding the norm circle that the kids come from, because they think about playing video games a lot. They understand them. They value them, and again how we can bring that within a coaching space. You could also again use, and sometimes I don't know if it's as problematic as it can be other times, but so and the reason I say that is another example that comes to mind where perhaps like I have a certain tendency when I'm calling a player by a name. Sometimes I add a wee Y to the end of it. It's like it could be like anyone, like Stevie or something like that, or Jimmy. I'll just say Y at the end of it, or O. But if you're working with young kids, I know that they're like, Mark's just called him that, and they laugh about it. But again, if it's a way for me to then build a relationship with them as a wider group and it's just fun and I know that they have that reaction, I can deliberately do things that goes against, not against, but things that I know creates a response from another norm circle as well. So you can be clever with it, but it's again how knowing when to do it and how to do it correctly, and
Yeah.
focusing on where it can go wrong as well.
Yeah. And
Um,
it's sometimes, we aren't ultimately able to appease all of the stakeholders that we are working with. Another example is where you're working with a group of players and also parents or carers, or they're watching the session. It might be that you're having a conscious strategy to try and step back a little bit and intervene with praise, feedback, questioning, and so on now and then. But largely, you want to step back and just allow things, use observation and silence to allow things to unfold. And again, from a parent's perspective, the normative expectation might be, well, I'm paying X amount for this session. Why is the coach standing back and not doing anything? And clearly there is a sound rationale behind that, with some intervention at necessary times. But from a parent's point of view, unless they're told, what is going on and why that's being done, and even if it is, told kind of to them why that's being done, there might be still a very different set of expectations. So you're right, kind of these normative intersections that we work within, from different cultures or from different perspectives. That there are often these situations where there isn't a straightforward answer. Sometimes there is more of a straightforward answer, and there are certain things that are inherently right or wrong to do. But in a lot of the spaces we work in, there are these conflicting norms and conflicting normative pressures which require reflexivity for us to navigate.
well, I know for sure that when I coach, sometimes I'm speaking to players, but I'm really speaking to their parents. Like I
Mm.
know that I sometimes will praise a player for a specific action in order to communicate indirectly to a parent about our culture and how what we care about. So I've seen players where I've been working with them, and maybe they've made a bad pass, but do you know what? It is the intent was there to play a pass forward, or to do something that was daring, and or perhaps to use their less practiced foot. So I will deliberately, very loudly and clearly, to ensure they notice it, praise that kid and say, well done, great intention, and I'll emphasize the word. And that's sort of in terms of the intersection between our norm circle and perhaps even the one that if the parents aren't in yet, they certainly have to maybe become part of. And that maybe brings me on my next example, where if again I think parents are acting in a way that's different from what we want or what we expect within our own culture. Again, I've found myself in the past, if I hear a player getting given instructions by a parent at the side, I'll deliberately say the player's name and I'll tell them to focus on what we are telling them. And again, it can be quite blunt, and other times it can be quite like the example from before, quite kind of sly and a bit sneakier in the way that I'm trying to do it. But again, coaches need to pay attention to these things, and they need to be able to be good at doing those sorts of things. Um, and I suppose it's almost like micro politics. There is an element of the things happening. The reason I'm staying with that word just for a moment is we were talking a little bit about how coaches can't control everything, but it makes me wonder: is the need to orchestrate, does it change depending on where you coach again? In terms of, I'm thinking now those that are working in professional sport, where they hold a lot more power. Maybe they do control their environment a lot more, where it isn't about doing what they can do and managing who they have in front of them, where they could actually literally change the player. I'm wondering, is orchestration felt differently? Not that I'm not necessarily suggesting that there isn't still a need to orchestrate, because they probably have other pressures that are different in that environment. But is the need to work around agency different depending on where you coach? And again, in terms of how much therefore coaches need to care about guiding the athlete to come on board with them. I'm just wondering, so I'm going back to that example with the parents, where one thing could be more direct, other thing needs to be subtler, or at least I've chose to be in that moment. But I'm just wondering, yeah, the idea of orchestration, it's funny. I'm just wondering what you think around the context to do with that word.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you raise, and I think there are certainly different degrees of ambiguity or orchestration that are required in different circumstances. As you say, in a professional domain, there may be very different power dynamics that exist, which shape the ways in which coaches are able to influence things normatively. And because of the power dynamics, the relationships that they have, ultimately players will recognize in some contexts that they have decision as to whether they're going to play or not, whether they're going to renew contracts and things like that. But equally, the coaches are probably aware in many circumstances that they are under pressure themselves from a board of directors or from in some cases they'll be still fighting for resources, fighting for their own contracts. And I think those degrees of power are incredibly important to also factor in when we are thinking about the normative pressures that people are under and how they try and influence other people, what they notice, what they pay attention to. Often that noticing can become very narrowed if we are under lots of pressure. So we focus on certain things and prioritize those again because we're under that degree of pressure that we need to try and navigate. So I think, yes, it can be different, the concept of orchestration in different environments. I would always argue that I think coaches need to orchestrate irrespective of which environments they're in. It's an inherent part of their role, the essence of coaching, if you like. But you also maybe think there about the concept of, I think Moscovici calls it private acceptance versus public compliance. And here they're interested in what, in and through influence, when are the moments when coaches or other individuals might influence others to shape the private beliefs that they hold about something, that the private values or norms and beliefs that they might have, versus when are they just influencing people to do something because they think others expect them to do that publicly. So they might not privately believe in it, but publicly they will display a certain action or behavior to other people. Whereas a very deep level of influence, social influence, is that where we change people's values, beliefs, and dispositions internally, what they think morally is the right thing to do in that set of circumstances. And again, that's another really interesting dynamic to explore, and is closely linked to again, power. Those power dynamics that exist from a player's point of view, an athlete or whoever the individual is. They're aware of these power dynamics as well as the normative pressures that face them often. So yeah, I think those would be kind of what spring to mind on that.
But yeah, because it's made me then just, I suppose the interesting thing about that is that coaches are influencers, but they're influenced. And if we are talking about the fact that coaches are going to ask players to take on certain values and beliefs, is there maybe a recognition that we need to be reflexive about perhaps why we believe things in the way that we do, and is it correct or morally just to then transfer those beliefs into the next group of players, and some beliefs are good and useful if it's technical. there are also social beliefs, and that's perhaps then a conversation about the wider culture within sport, and again, sport being a microcosm of society.
Yeah.
Coaches probably need to be more mindful of their societal views creeping into their own practice and how that is going to perpetuate certain things for good reasons or otherwise. And I'm just wondering around that now, because again, this conversation we're having about noticing what others people do, that can be flipped about noticing what we do. And I'm something I'm always very big on, I think, with coaches is there's two parts, in my opinion, to be getting better as a coach. And to just and what I see is between a novice and an expert, I've always, and a lot of the research looks at this, is that a big mediator in that developmental journey is often self-awareness. Because if you aren't aware of yourself, you can't get better and know that you need to do something more, just perhaps you're doing something good already. Again, it's about identifying the good and the bad and the ugly. But part of self-awareness requires reflection, okay, in terms of why did an event occur? And look, we've just spoke through a framework about intentional influence, non-influence, unintended influence. So that's one framework of many that could form part of that conversation. But there's also then a need to fact check the conclusions you reach based on recognizing your fallibility as a person and a product of society. So that's where I always think reflexivity is so important as well, because there's in some ways, if you're reflective but not reflexive, there's problems within that in a way as well, depending then on what values and beliefs you then cause an athlete to internalize. And that's where, again, thinking about your own biases. Why do you believe the way you believe? Is it because you believe in it, or is it because you were taught to believe in it? And again, this is just a conversation that starts out of paying more attention to the different things that you do and don't do. Why do you not, question why, not just why you put this belief forward, but why do you not put another belief forward? And this is where, again, I think your work is starting to raise questions we need to think about as coaches, because this is all part of that. We're talking about how often do you hear about toxic cultures in sport, and the actors that are part of that, coaches, cannot realise perhaps that they're part of doing something that isn't great. If it's around attitudes around mental health or mental health literacy, like certainly like within sort of male-dominated sports or spaces, these are ongoing conversations. Well, I think actually, I just plucked that one out of thin air a little bit. Well, I think we're actually getting better at that. There are still things that coaches will say and do that they aren't maybe conscious of. And again, I just wonder, because I've seen that word coming up in your work, reflexivity. Is that something that sociologists are considering around, and we need to pay more attention? Perhaps people say we as if there isn't coaches that think about sociology, but we do need to invite it in more. And I'm just
I think so. Yeah, reflexivity for me is really important in whatever we are doing. Often we think about it in a research sense. How are you reflexive on the impact you have as a researcher when you're working in an environment, working with participants, conducting research in that space, but also from a practitioner point of view, from an everyday life point of view, how are we reflexive of the things that we are sometimes reproducing, or either reproducing or changing those cultures, those beliefs, values, and dispositions, and to understand, as you mentioned earlier, where have those come from, recognizing, is it through our upbringing, is it through our interactions we've had in certain cultures or organizations that we've been that has shaped our dispositions and beliefs that we hold. And then it might be a critical incident, or it might just be an everyday interaction which challenges those. And I think that for me, coaches who are really astute and effective are able to be reflexive on their positions and go, well, actually, I'm happy to be challenged. I'm going to be robust in my challenge and understanding where something, a belief or assumption, has come from, and then not be frightened to change that if it's necessary. Sometimes we don't see these things until a certain, we might interact. Maybe on a course that we are on, it might be a discussion that we have with a mentor or a friend or a colleague, which prompts us to think in a slightly different way, and just being reflexive on our own approaches, perspectives, and values that are, maybe something that we've had a long, often with values or dispositions and beliefs that they are long standing, or they are deep rooted. So sometimes it can be very difficult to change. But I think, yeah,
then maybe we need to get into new coaches, and maybe this needs to be something that coach education, that for starting coaches, and we're talking about not wanting to overcomplicate things, but maybe for these reasons, if we really want coaching to, and the next generation of coaches to take off, we need to get them thinking reflexively as quickly as we can. Just maybe that could be it, because what are coaches going to rely most upon at the starting point of their journey? And again, I say this, but I'm also going to now argue, because that's then their safety net, because they don't have much else to rely on, and I get it. But again, if we're wanting to break cycles, and again, this isn't just around topics that are contentious in terms of more societal based. It could be things like just coaching methodologies and just general approaches to coaching within their subculture. But again, there's a tension to be had here. We need to get that reflexive thinking in. I don't, and maybe you might have had different experiences of this, but I don't think as coaches we're taught to be reflexive. I think we're taught to be reflective. I don't know if we're taught so much about reflexivity. And we see it as academics in terms of we're now made to think reflexively for what? For quality assurance. And this is maybe where the coaching world can benefit from the academic world, just through borrowing on some of our practices that ultimately we use to reach truth, whatever that means, but we use it to get closer to truth. And that's what every coach is going to want. And I think coaches listening to this really should be encouraged to think about quality assurance, to think about these things, because they might be wrong and they don't know what they don't know until they start to pick at these things, and they can use,
Yeah, and vice versa. I think we can learn a lot from coaches. I work with some excellent coaches who are very reflexive on their practice of their values, dispositions, and beliefs, and how that informs and shapes what they do on a day-to-day basis. So I think, yeah, there's definitely benefit from both academia, practice, learning from one another. But yeah, for me, as you say, it's a crucial skill for us to develop, just to be. I think people like structure as well. You mentioned that point of what do we fall back on, and people often like having some element of structure. We can't just have everything where it's completely, where we are, just working. Yes, we are working with an ambiguity and kind of uncertainty all of the time, but we do fall back upon that balance of structure and agency. What are those things that we do fall back on, but being mindful of why that approach is being used, or being mindful of what is really guiding or shaping our practice. Is that best for the people that we are working with, or is it just because it's something that I've seen, or something I've noticed and has become embedded within my practice because I've received that as a player in the past from a coach, for example. And that's often a really good point for us. I think Anna Stotter and Chris Cushion call it kind of this filter, don't they? They call it a way in which coaches can understand what is best for the circumstances that they are working, and they might be receiving lots of these different messages about how to coach, how to do certain things, what is best, but kind of filtering that out and working for them what is the most appropriate set of circumstances, because we're all very different individuals, and like we mentioned earlier, we've come from different experiences, different cultures, and it's about embracing that diversity of thought and that diversity of experiences that are brought into the fold of coaching, to really kind of make the most of that and be reflexive on our positions and use that to support what we do to work with players and athletes, whoever it is.
Yeah. So I'd love to end, Adam, on getting your thoughts. You'd mentioned that you've been doing workshops recently with coaches, and you're starting to feel that coaches are showing a want and a will to learn about the social aspect of sport, and I'm just wondering, what's your appraisal of the current state of coach development with regards to some of the learnings and the teachings from sociology? Where do you think it's going? How do you think it's progressing in terms of the impact that sociological views such as the ones that you've disseminated for us today? Where do you think the future is in coach development around this, and is it getting better, or is it plateauing? What do you see it as at the moment?
Yeah, I think from workshops that we've done recently and in the past, coaches often find sometimes challenging, sometimes difficult to navigate some of these areas initially. But then the feedback we get is that actually from having gone through the process of it, it's very rewarding, very beneficial, and things which they need as part of their role, to have that level of challenge and discomfort initially of things like ambiguity, orchestration, whatever it is that we're talking about, and engaging with that level of uncomfortability to then go, well, actually, yeah, I do these things on a day-to-day basis. I'm often taught these really important things coming through from an education point of view on the technical, tactical aspects and so on. But to then also have this understanding of, as I said earlier, how we manage relations, conflict, emotions, what influences our practice as coaches from a structure and agency point of view, and so on, things like trust and trustworthiness, micropolitics, and these things. I think coaches always, the feedback we tend to get is that we're supporting them to navigate a lot of these issues. They might have been wrestling with these things for a long time and not really, in some cases, having things to draw back upon. So just having that lens or that framework for them to continue to think with, and it's almost a little bit uncomfortable to say, right, we're not going to necessarily give you any solutions today.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to give you an answer, which I think is often a legacy effect that people might expect that or might want that, and that's natural in many respects. But when we challenge that position in the coach education or the workshops and support in mentoring that we're doing, often it's about prompting and facilitating these questions. How can we use and draw upon the theory, evidence, and frameworks as a tool to think with and reflect upon, rather than a specific map or set of criteria that will help us? So I think for me, that's, it's recognizing again and building upon the good work which has already been done, and not saying that one particular approach is better than another. It's just adding a different dimension, which for me, in my opinion, is crucial to have that sociological insight, that understanding of, how are we influencing people? How are we, what are the goals that we want to achieve, and recognizing that we're never necessarily going to achieve all of those, but how do we work towards those in a better manner and have that sufficient alignment to help us in our context that we are working in.
Yeah. Maybe we need coach developers to not feel like they need to have all the answers then as well, because I think and being a coach developer myself, you do feel when you're working with coaches, that idea that they do expect the answer to be given by you, they expect that and they want that. But again, it's about what's their wants versus what's the needs of a coach, and maybe we do need to design coach education in a way that we leave coaches a bit more frustrated at times, but at the same time provide them tools that they can investigate, their own questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think again, it's a balance. There are times where, as a coach developer, coach educator, we might need to give some specific information. We might need to be a little bit more direct at times, whereas there might be other situations where, like you mentioned, we ask a question or we flip things around and say, well, actually, how might you have navigate that specific interaction with a parent, a carer, coach, assistant coach, player, whoever it is? How might we've navigate that differently? And what could like we mentioned earlier, what was some of the courses of action that you decided not to take in this circumstance? Well, had you have taken those, what might the potential impact have been on those different stakeholders that we are working with? So, and I think a lot of the time it's often, how can we think proactively to manage these things, and I've seen some very astute examples of kind of coaching practice where people have learned from previous interactions and have managed the situation very well to sell what they're doing and to have a better impact across the whole group. Now, one example which comes to mind here is that a coach in a squad which I was observing, one of the professionals in the squad had come in and was clearly respected by the rest of the team, was respected, held in high regard by the coach. And the coach, the team had lost a game in essence. And the coach has decided that he was going to be quite firm on this player who was the professional in the squad. But strategically, he'd gone in beforehand and said, he'd had a conversation on a one-to-one basis with this professional before the team debrief at the end of the game and said, look, I'm going to go quite hard here. with you, and just made sure that he was okay with that, to which he was, and then went into the team debrief, and because he was quite firm with that player, that helped to develop trust and buy-in, respect from the rest of the group. It didn't destroy the relationship with that player, but it showed to the rest of the team, well, actually the coach is able to do that the player is agreeing this, professional who was held in high regard from everybody else. So that was, for me, a strategic way of, rather than going straight in, which a coach might have done previously, and just taking quite a firm stance and then destroy the relationship with that, not only that player, but others, to manage it in that way, to then think, well, actually, it's had a productive impact for multiple individuals. So it comes back to that notion of, well, how do we read what's the potential intended impact versus unintended or non-influence that might have here for that coach? And that it's not to say, again, that will work all of the time. That could have had a negative impact. And who's to say that the professional wasn't just putting on a front or surface acting to say, well, actually, yes, I'm fine with it, but deep down they might not have been. So, who knows? But I think, those types of things, discussions that we have with coaches, reflecting back on what they've done, this is where I think recall is a really useful, powerful tool for us to stimulate those questions when we are, show coaches back what has happened in games or sessions. We might not have noticed it in the direct moment itself, but just through prompting and facilitating those questions. From some of the research that we've done, coaches often say, this is the best form of CPD, although it was more so research. It was, done for research purposes. Sometimes they would say, this is the best form of CPD I've ever had from a coaching point of view, because it's looking, in depth at what I've done. You're asking me questions about why I've done that, or what's, the influence that has brought about. So I think this can maybe be hopefully used as a useful tool, this methodology and this approach of asking these questions, drawing upon theory, evidence, or literature to support practice, and just prompt thought about what is going on and why that's maybe the case.
And perhaps the sort of what really allows that to be so effective is that the questions you're asking aren't to do with athletic performance. They aren't to do with, the way the exercise was put together. Although I understand that can be a relevant question within sociology. There's like social materiality of things, and that's part of, and that's another conversation for a different day. But it's taken them out of the bubble of seeing coaching as just the pedagogy of it, and it's actually who you're working with. And again, this is, like, as you say, like, coaches are going to need to learn, and they need to make mistakes, but they have to just frame part of the development is about developing social skills that are coaching skills. And again, maybe it's about flipping it a little bit then, and thinking about how our reflection can encompass more than just what we're always drawn towards, which is the outcome. Because, like we've just had a conversation about today, you don't know if you're creating that outcome, and that's the part. Then, for that reason alone, maybe we need to start to address as many different aspects of our job as that we can do, and you're now putting a spotlight on one such aspect. So no, it's brilliant to hear, Adam. Unless there's anything else that you think we haven't covered already, we can leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on, Adam. I hope everyone that's been listening is taking as much value from that conversation and as much value as I certainly have. It's been great to hear about. And again, as someone who does have a bias towards psychology, does have a bias towards pedagogy, again, it is so enriching to then think about things in more sociological terms, not to replace other ologies that are going to form part of your coach's toolkit, but just to add to it. And I think actually is what I've found as we have spoke today, Adam, is that it's actually helping my understanding of psychology, it's actually helping my understanding of pedagogy, and it's helping my understanding of continuous development through knowing what I need to be thinking about and starting to then draw on different frameworks that are out there that all have their own diverse, unique qualities. And this is just such one.
I think you're absolutely right, Mark. And for me, it's just as I mentioned with research philosophies earlier, these disciplines are really important to work together, understand what are the interstices or the ways in which these disciplines overlap. Lots of social psychology, for example, is quite close to sociology, social principles. And I think it's important these things are intertwined in practice. Sociology, pedagogy, psychology, these things are all interacting. So the more that we can make sense of these together rather than position them as distinct categories
Yeah,
or disciplines
yeah.
which don't inform each other, I think is really a powerful way to perhaps move forward. But yeah, thanks again hugely
Yeah.
for the invite. I've enjoyed the
Do you know
discussion.
what? Do you know what? I want to get this point in as well, because it's just came to me. We'll end up talking all day. We will. I promise those that listen. We will cut it at this. But if, if we're actually looking at, as you just said, the need to accompany all need for coaching science to be accompanied by lots of ologies. I think there is also a trend. The more coaches learn about different ologies, coaching as its own practice starts to subvert itself to different disciplines. Like I say this all the time, like coaches can learn a lot from sports psychology. Coaching is not sports psychology. They can learn a lot from sports science, but coaching is not sports science. And actually, probably of all the disciplines out there, where I actually see more coach science specific frameworks are actually those that draw from sociology, because they tend to, I'll probably, this might be a wee bit controversial, but they do tend to still situate coaching as its own activity in a way that is a lot clearer, I think, than sometimes what I see elsewhere. And it's not often probably through intention, but just I think through the way people will assimilate information and will just naturally begin to want to reflect back what they've read and what they see as part of the practice. These frameworks that we've mentioned today, coaching as orchestration, noticing, that's coaching's theory. That's a model that's shaped around coaching. We're talking about theories of coaching, models of coaching, models for coaching. We can't forget, as we learn about different disciplines, to still remember to come back to disciplines, to your discipline, which is coaching. Coaching is your discipline, and it's to that, if we have that awareness, we're only going to further enrich the discipline of coaching, but not replace it. And I think, again, where perhaps we see practice by coaches that looks like it's a bit leaky and there's certain gaps, it's probably because we're leaning too much towards becoming a proxy version of another discipline when coaching is its discipline. But the relational aspect and the social active coaching that allows for all other disciplines to be able to be made better sense of, that can be really enhanced by harnessing the power of sociology. And I think that's something that's came from it. So that's just my political point I like to put on things. Probably can get a bit of backdraft from that. So no, thanks so much, Adam. Thanks for coming on, and yeah, thanks for listening for those that are paying attention.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks, guys.